Most of y'all already remember this famous scene of Ike and Tina, this is not from the movie, fighting in the limousine. Did you know that they could be possibly a representation of the sun and the moon? Yes, there are many folk tales of the sun and the moon getting into fights. Here's one from a Filipino folk tale. Once the sun and the moon were married, they shared a home in the sky. When the moon left to collect vegetables from the jungle, she asked the sun to guard their sleeping children. She also warned him to stay a safe distance away from the babies since his heat would burn them. The sun kept close watch over the children, but he was overcome with affection for them and wanted to kiss them goodnight. But he forgot the moon's warnings and leaned over the babies, and they melted beneath him. Horrified at his foolishness and afraid of his wife's rage, the sun hid. The moon came back home, came back to an empty sky house and discovered what had happened. After some time, the sun returned, and he and the moon had a terrible fight. The sun threw the jungle vegetables at the moon's face, and that was the final straw. The moon abandoned the sun for good. This is why on a full night, you can see the marks by the sun against the moon's face. The lost children have become stars, and the sun constantly chases the moon, trying to win back her affections. So the reason why you see the blemishes on the moon is because of the fight and the vegetables that were thrown at her face by the sun. And there are people who have lived and died, and they believe this as their religion. Here's an African version of the story from the Maasai. In the beginning, the sun married the moon. They traveled together for a long time, the sun leading and the moon following. As they traveled, the moon would get tired and the sun would carry her for 3 days every month. Sounds like the time frame that you can't see the moon, the new moon. On the 4th day, the donkeys are said to be able to see the moon. People can only see the moon on the 5th day. One day the moon made a mistake and she was beaten by the sun. But it happened that the moon was a short-tempered woman. When she was beaten, she fought back and wounded the sun's forehead. The sun also beat the moon and scratched her face and plucked out one of her eyes. When the sun realized that he was wounded, he was very embarrassed and said to himself, "I'm going to shine so hard that people will not be able to look at me." And so he shone so hard that the people could not look at him without squinting. That is why the sun shines so brightly. As for the moon, she did not feel any embarrassment, and so she did not have to shine any brighter. And even now, if one looks closely at the moon, they will see the wounds that the sun inflicted on her during their fight. These are the stories that people have leaned on and believed because they didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand that the moon is reflecting sunlight and that the scarring on the moon is from impact craters and things of that nature. So they leaned onto stories that they created. Even to this day, the majority of people are believing on stories that were created 2,000 plus years ago as to why things exist and how we find our salvation and how we find our inner God is, because they just didn't know. So the reason why they had droughts is because of the sun god. The reason why they had hurricanes is because of the hurricane god. The volcano god created volcanoes and exploded in people's faces and destroyed their villages and towns. The reason why they had diseases is because they were disobedient to the gods. This mentality, although we can look at a folklore like these and say that, oh, well, we're not that crazy. We don't believe in things like that. But people are still believing that snakes were talking, donkeys were talking, that cities were destroyed because of their wickedness, that people, because dude was not ejaculating in his new wife, who was his former sister-in-law, that's now, that was sinful and he died because he was so wicked to this deity. People are accepting that the sun stood still in the sky so that Joshua can continue to defeat his enemies, not understanding the earth rotation and this movement around the sun. So they made up stories. And yet people still believe these stories and lean on these stories and count them as truth as to why things happen. If you truly want to understand how the universe functions, you have to stop believing in these stories. But you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibration.